Some of you may have already got a copy of Don and Carlos's fantastic new book. In the picture, the facts behind the fiction in Evelyn Moore's Sword Honour. As we all know, Evelyn Moore's War record is a source of quite a lot of controversy and consternation. And Don and Carlos have done a fantastic archival academic job of digging up some news sources, looking at everything we think we might know about war's life in the Second World War, and sort of trying to bust some of those most commonly held myths. So it's a real groundbreaking book, and come out just in time for us to have some reading for it at the conference. There are order forms for the book downstairs on the bookstall, and the publishers are very kindly giving us a 25% off discount just for this conference. So there's my plug. So I'm here at Don and Carlos, and I think you're going to explain a little bit about the background of the book and then do some readings. And then if we have some questions, then that's
right.
That's going to be great. Okay.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I must admit, it's a very hard time of the day for Spaniards to talk publicly. My body is asking for siesta, you know. But your presence here deserves this and much more. Right, it's an honor and a privilege for us to be able to give this presentation of our book today. And first of all, I would like to thank Martin Stannard, Barbara Cook, and all those involved in the organization of this conference for making it possible. And of course, we wish to thank Alexander Waugh, here, for your support and for your guidance throughout the project. And yes, I would like to say just a few words about the prehistory, the background of this project, of this book. Well, obviously, Don's Gallagher statue as one of the most eminent war scholars needs no presentation. He has spent decades of silent and meticulous work. He has visited dozens of, hundreds of libraries, archives, conducted interviews, and has unearthed new evidence on numerous matters connected with Waugh's life and writings, in particular with Waugh's involvement in the Second World War. It was in the conference, was it 2011 perhaps? Mm-hmm. The conference held at Downside that the first idea came to my mind about this project. I think it was a lady, I can't remember who she was or who he was, but commenting on Don's paper or some presentation, she said, it's a pity, or I wish Donald could found time to make, to collect all his immense knowledge about Waugh's war in a book, right? And this was a sort of revelation for me. I said, well, what can I do to make Don collect all his material in a book, even at the risk of presenting me as a traveling companion, right? So I was turning over in my mind this idea. In turn, I have been working on the trilogy for a number of years, for a decade, in fact, because I've done a critical edition and translation into Spanish of the 3 books separately. And my introductions were quite long. They dealt with interpretation, matters of interpretation, but also with matters of biography and history. So I thought that perhaps I could adapt my introductions into and make them into 3 chapters of a book on Sword of Honor. So we discussed the matter over, and he was as good as to accept me as a traveling companion, as I said, and we joined efforts since. It is true that we have conducted independent research, but once the project was accepted for publication, we revised each other's texts and we made comments, but of course in this exchange, I was the apprentice and he was the teacher, or using the parallelism between Evelyn and Smith for the teacher and the pupil, right? After a painful search for a publisher, we ended up, we were accepted by Rodopi, that now has been taken over by Brill, and there started the second phase, perhaps more painful even, in which we were invited to edit and proofread the text. Rodopi, some of you might know that makes its authors were very hard on that, There is a very formidable general editor, right, who makes us suggestions as very strict formatting protocol. For example, the full stop after quotation marks comes after the last quotation mark, except when the quotation is preceded by a semicolon. In that case, the full stop comes before the last quotation mark, and so on and so forth, right? So we labored hard for almost a year and a few months on this. Well, anyway, this is the final product, right? It's a very nice book. And of course, for me, taking part in this project has been a challenge and a privilege and honor. And Don's immense knowledge and wisdom is only matched by his humility. And yes, I proved that humility in his dealing with his traveling companion. Right, so without much ado, let me just read a few extracts from the introduction. Right. On the 27th of August 1939, just 5 days after Evelyn Waugh had read about the Russia-German alliance and had become convinced that there was no reason, quote, why war should be delayed, unquote, he wrote in his diaries. My inclinations are all to join the army as a private. I have to consider 30 years of novel writing ahead of me. Nothing would be more likely than work in a government office to finish me as a writer. Nothing more likely to stimulate me than a complete change of habit. There is a symbolic difference between fighting as a soldier and serving as a civilian, even if the civilian is more valuable. Indeed, after 3 months of painful search, Waugh finally won a commission in the Royal Marines and remained mobilized for the duration of the war. He was right. His change of habit stimulated most of his eventual literary output. Apart from the unfinished work suspended, interrupted when he joined up, he wrote one of the first novels dealing with the Second World War, Put Down More Flags, in Angus Calder's words, the funniest book about the phony war. Then came his masterpiece, Brides Revisited, which according to its preface is a souvenir of the Second War. And finally the 3 novels comprising the war trilogy, Men at Arms, Officers and Gentlemen, and Unconditional Surrender. Yet the inspiration the conflict brought about also had a disturbing effect on our writer. It became, so to speak, a war to end war. In a letter to Nancy Mitford, dated on the 23rd of October 1954, while gathering the momentum to get Officers and Gentlemen finished, Waugh confessed that he found it quote, hard to think of novel plots, and concluded that his life has ceased with the war. Douglas Patey agrees that the war commenced for Waugh a period of increasing, finally permanent despondency. The development of the conflict implied a progressive sense of disillusion and of national shame. Although Sykes may be right when he affirms that Waugh never had a love affair with the army as strongly as does Charles Ryder, for that matter Guy Crouchback, he certainly joined up with an adventurous spirit that suffered the process of deterioration as the confrontation went on. Like his character, he conceived the outlook of war in terms of civilization versus totalitarianism, and believed in the moral rectitude of going to war to safeguard Poland's integrity. Consequently, the alliance with the USSR in 1941 and the ensuing British policies of support of communist regimes, first Russia and then partisan Yugoslavia, were moral blows Waugh could hardly endure. The final outcome of the conflict, with the subjugation of Poland and other Central and Eastern European nations under Soviet rule, further exacerbated this pervading sense of national shame. Using a remarkable daring turn of phrase for a text written in 1947, Waugh came to affirm that the war had cast its heroic and chivalrous disguise and became a sweaty tug of war between teams of indistinguishable louds. The war also ended war in another sense, creating his conviction that the age of Hooper, with its accompanying barbarism, materialism, and Philistinism, had taken over throughout the civilized world, and that he no longer had a place there. In the words of Patey, it left him prematurely aged and embittered. He would live 20 more years after the mobilization and write some of his greatest prose, but in important ways, Waugh's emotional and intellectual development ended in 1945. The war was the crucible in which his mature pessimism was fully formed. Sword of Honor reflects Waugh's military experiences and growing disillusion from 1939 to 1945, set against the background of world-scale catastrophes and political and domestic concerns. This study, which attempts to place the trilogy in history, comprises two mutually reinforcing sections. The first part, A Place in That Battle, offers a general introduction to the factual dimensions of the trilogy and to the historical and biographical events that inspire them. It concentrates attention on the fictional components closest to history and biography in order to inform discussion of the way in which historical and autobiographical fiction can assist better understanding of the immeasurable complexity of what happened during the Second World War. The sources drawn upon here offer insights not only into policy, such as regards alliances at the highest level, but also into matters such as the special cadre training of temporary officers in the Royal Marines, the atmosphere surrounding Operation Menace in Dakar, the formation, peculiarities, and early training of the British commandos, the last days of the Battle of Crete, the inner working of combined operations, and the British mission in support of the Yugoslav partisans in Topuzko and Dubrovnik. They also provide information about the process of mobilization in that strange threshold period, the Boer War, life in the midst of air raid precautions, London under the Blitz, and the effects of propaganda on public opinion. The discussion intertwines fiction, memory, and fact in such a way that the reader at some point may not be certain whether the quoted text is fictional or non-fictional. But this confusion, where it exists, is deliberate, and its main purpose is to underline the reality that historical fact may be contained in fiction or autobiography. Thus, this first section of the study introduces general readers to the background of the trilogy and provides some basic guidelines to help make sense of the historical context, knowledge of which should not always be taken for granted. All right, I will stop here.
Thank you,
The floor
Carlos.
is yours, Dan.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for Martin and Barbara for putting this on the program. It's very, very kind of you to do so. Now, the intention behind my part of In the Picture, which I must say is not as attractive as Carlos's. Carlos is a novelist as well as a scholar, and he writes a very attractive story. Mine is a rather dense argument with using a lot of archival material. But anyway, the intention behind my part of In the Picture was to re-examine 4 areas of Evelyn Flor's military service that have been violently criticised. And when I say violently, I mean not only vituperatively, but kind of widespread and talked about by people with no relation to war whatsoever. So you get a little book on the commandos, and here's an irrelevant footnote saying Evelyn Waugh was in the commandos. He should never have been a soldier. He did this, he did that, he did all sorts of things. So he's been widely and irrelevantly criticised as well as violently. So I planned to do what I was going to do, not by disputing what is already in print, although some fresh evidence does conflict with existing wisdom, but by presenting as much new evidence as I could dig up and letting it speak for itself. That was the intention. The reality turned out to be that in order to make the new material intelligible, I had to fill in the context. So the Crete chapter, there is a chapter on Crete, Cretan Labyrinth, the way out, is the product of years of work in 11 archives, but it contains nothing that hasn't been in print before, except a reference to Theseus, not 1 but 2 Minotaurs, and Ariadne. So I'll say nothing about the Crete chapter today. Now, the first chapter poses a question in response to the assertion laid down by Christopher Sykes: was Waugh utterly unfitted to be an officer? Now, it covers the 7 main periods of service and the numerous units in which he found himself. But today I shall roughly confine myself to Sykes's and others' comments that occur around the period May 42 to July 43, when Waugh worked within the Special Service Brigade. For some reason, Sykes's comments, and remember, Sykes spent 2 weeks with Waugh during the war, and those 2 weeks, on his own telling, were very, very happy. He saw none of the darker side of Evelyn Waugh, and so he's channeling one critic, really, and that is Major Brian Franks. So it isn't like a considered summing up of evidence. It's really taking one person's word for it. So Sykes and others gave Waugh an appalling and widely believed character, mainly for allegedly despising and bullying the troops under his command and of being disliked to the extent that he would have been shot by his men if he went into action, and even worse, that he had to have a guard placed over his sleeping quarters in case the men murdered him during the night. Now, Lord Lovat and Major Tom Churchill dismissed Waugh as totally incompetent and a joke officer. Now, to illustrate how evidence regarding how evidence often flatly contradicts, I quote Lord Lovat's widely publicised view about Waugh's habit of dress. When war emerged, it was in shit order, without equipment, belt, boots or anklets. Now, by complete contrast, his commanding officer in Yugoslavia, Sir Fitzroy MacLean, praises Waugh specifically for keeping up Brigade of Guards standards in difficult circumstances. As a fighting soldier, Waugh was very keen on being smart and tidy, and I think he did that extremely well. Right, so what I'm not trying to disprove what Lovat said. I'm simply saying, look, there are two opinions. We've got to take both into account to get a rounded picture. So on weightier matters, such as despising and bullying subordinates and general competence, I quote two new voices. Now, Waugh was in charge of the intelligence section within the Special Services Brigade. And the first voice I quote is that of his sergeant, Sergeant P.V. Harris. Now, Harris was not uncritical of Waugh. He hated Waugh's sickly smile for some reason that I can't quite fathom. But the diary contains comments such as Captain Waugh behaved impatiently. But that's quickly followed by, he's been very pleasant. Now, Waugh did Harris significant favours and kept up a good working relationship with him in what appears to be, in contrast to what has often been written, a normally functioning office. So I'll just read you my little conclusion to that on 154. So I've written, in short, Harris reveals a working relationship between captain and sergeant, with its moments of impatience balanced by pleasantness and support and favours done, that bears little relationship to the portrait painted by Major Churchill, for example, of an officer who never does a bloody thing except make social engagements on the telephone. Now, far less does Waugh emerge as a bully, bent on humiliating his subordinates. So, again, it's a question of, right, Major Churchill made an observation, that's a valid observation, this gives a different picture. It all has to be taken into account. Now, another voice is that of a private in the signals section within that Special Service Brigade headquarters. Now, in a letter which Alexander kindly made available to me, Private Austin shows himself aware of Waugh's isolation within that headquarters. Waugh himself spoke of being in a condition of Coventry in that area, but he expresses a marked preference for Waugh over the other officers. Now, the point I would make of that is that in a closed world of a military unit, it would have been very well known among the ranks if Waugh had despised and bewildered and bullied his men. And if that had been true, Private Austin would not have responded to Captain Waugh as sympathetically as he did. So that's just a couple of other voices. Now, I think time, I've already said enough, I think, on other occasions in print about the allegation that Waugh was so disliked that Colonel Laycock had to appoint a guard over him at night time lest he be murdered. Waugh's batman of the time had one word for that: absolute rubbish. Now, I had a long interview with Lady Laycock too, and she was totally of the same opinion, that A, it didn't happen, and B, no circumstance arose that would have made it necessary. Now, she had very close contacts throughout the brigade, and she said it was exactly the kind of thing her husband would have said to her if it had happened, but she was adamant that it was total nonsense. So I won't say more about it. I could say that Christopher Sykes on these matters is absolutely not a reliable source. When he was writing the book, he was quite ill. He'd unwisely undertaken another book before doing the Waugh book, and he was under pressure of time. And I think a lot of the time he just wrote what came into his head without the slightest checking. I'll So I'll just read you one little passage which illustrates why I find Sykes absolutely unreliable. Now, he justifies his allegation that Laycock set this guard over Waugh by saying that in Crete, an officer of number 8 Commando had been killed in action, but the circumstances were odd, and it was widely suspected that this intensely unpopular man had in fact been murdered by one of his subordinates. Certainly that was even Waugh's opinion. Now, every statement in that paragraph is absolutely wrong. First, number 8 Commando was never in Crete. At the time of the Battle of Crete, one part of it was engaged at Tobruk, the other part was in camp in Egypt. Second, the intensely unpopular man suspected of being murdered by one of his subordinates was not an officer of number 8 Commando at all. He was Colonel Dick Pedder, who commanded the Scottish commandos, and he was killed on the Litany River, not in Crete. And as for Waugh's opinion, Waugh says we shall never know who killed him. Many of his men had sworn to do so, and he was shot in the back by a sniper. He had, however, just led a successful assault, and it seems an unlikely occasion for murder. So as for saying that he was completely in favour is ridiculous. Now, I would like to say, now my third chapter is called Liquidated, how Lord Lovett kicked Waugh out of the Special Service Brigade and fantasised about it afterwards. Now, as I was saying myself, this chapter is packed with new information. I believe it puts the events of the kicking out of Waugh into a new light and demonstrates that Lovett's account of the sacking, which I'm afraid every biographer, both major and minor, I've counted up every single one, has accepted. But his story is pure fantasy. Now I can only make a couple of points about it. The first one is that Lord Lovett's character was turbulent in the extreme. He was sacked from his own family regiment, the Lovett Scouts, which was quite an achievement. And you can't take things, he says, as coming from a normal commanding officer. He had a very difficult relationship with Laycock, Colonel Laycock, who was his brigadier. And far from Laycock being complicit with Lovett in sacking Waugh, as is often asserted, the sacking was done in part to spite Laycock. Now, after the F, in which Lovett performed really brilliantly, Lovett had trouble with transport for his troops, and he struck the Q officer, a chap called Major Romilly. Now, that was a very serious offence, and only Laycock's diplomacy got him off the court-martial. He then gave his men unsigned and undated travel warrants and leave passes, which led to some of his men being picked up by the military police, which caused another huge fuss, and great consternation at headquarters. So Lovett replied to official criticism with a letter copied to one and all, which ended, "I can be a great deal ruder if so required." So we'll go, and this is what happened. Right. So after returning to England, he struck the officer. Now, this letter, which ended up, "I can be ruder than this if required," caused great trouble at the headquarters, and the chief Brigadier Anthony Head, the chief military planner at the Combined Operations Headquarters, and later Minister of State for War, wrote to the commanding officer of the Special Service Brigade, that's Laycock, enclosing Lovett's letter, "I'm rather annoyed with one of your temperamental prima donnas in the shape of Lovett. The commandos have plenty of enemies, and it's merely providing them with welcome ammunition if the commanding officers decide to flout all conventional procedures." And then explain their behaviour with rudeness, which in a more rigid headquarters would be considered insolence. Now, Brigadier Laycock then rebuked Lovett. He said, "I regard your postscript as rude and out of hand." And he went on to condemn the attitude of not giving a damn for anyone or anything, and telling all and sundry where they got off. Now, over the following months, Laycock consistently wrapped Lovett over the knuckles, as he put it. As time went on, Laycock reprimanded Lovett with increasing acrimony. For example, for putting criticism of other services in writing, for lack of tact in dealing with officers who are not from the same social strata, and for arrogance. And then when Lovett applied for a promotion to brigadier, Laycock opposed it and wrote him a letter explaining that this sort of overweening ambition was not a good thing. And a proud man like Lovett would have hated that like poison, which he did. So the next... So Laycock was not likely to be complicit in a scheme dreamed up by Lovett to force Waugh, as Lovett called Laycock's sidekick, as Lovett called him, out of the brigade. And the proof were needed. After Waugh had been forced to resign by General Charles Hayden, General Hayden then wrote to Laycock, then campaigning in Italy, and he wrote, "Waugh has caused trouble and is going. I know very well that this will disappoint and probably annoy you." Well, that's putting it mildly. Laycock had every reason to be desperately annoyed. For a deputy like Lovett to go to a general and get that general to countermand the orders of his brigadier was an act of appalling disloyalty and, of course, very out of the ordinary. And so when Laycock received General Hayden's letter, it dealt with many matters, so I'm not saying what happened just because of war, but the letter containing this information about the sacking of Waugh was answered by a very long telegram in 2 parts, in which Laycock said that at the conclusion of Operation Husky, he would seek to be relieved of command. So the myth that Laycock tacitly colluded with Lovett and Hayden in order to get Waugh out of the brigade is really vaporised by Hayden's letter saying, "Look, I know you'll be annoyed by this," and by the telegram announcing the wish to be relieved of command. But, so I just do want to make one more point, and that about Lovett's fantasy about what happened. Now, in his memoir, let's go to, in his memoir, Lovett gives an account of this sacking, which is really extraordinary. He says, I granted Waugh compassionate leave with instructions to report on completion. After 2 weeks, Evelyn had not shown up. He was said to be passing his time at White's. Summoned and asked for an explanation. He was handed a railway warrant and ordered to the depot where I suggested some training might not come amiss. That's all very good. He then goes on to say, Waugh could not contain himself and stormed unannounced into General Hayden's office. Nobody, said Waugh, could interfere with the arrangements made for his departure overseas. It was a rash speech. He was sacked on the spot for insubordination. Well, in a television interview a little bit later, Gallagher gave a different account. He was storming in to the general, being rude to the general, and then the general sending him up to Lord Louis Mountbatten, who fired him. Now, the point is that none of this happened. There was no meeting. Waugh received a letter saying, you are to go to the depot, and General Hayden confirms it. Waugh wrote immediately to the General asking for an interview. The General wrote that same day saying, yes, tomorrow, 17th, 10 o'clock please. And so Waugh went to an interview the next day at 10 o'clock. During that interview, Hayden forced him into a corner, and Waugh, like an idiot, offered his resignation. Now, but that resignation was sort of forced. I don't believe he should have offered it, but he did. But what Lovett says is absolutely untrue. Now, there was no meeting. Waugh didn't storm in anywhere. He wrote for an interview and was granted an interview. It's as simple as that. Then he was forced out. Now, my argument would be that when a book contains an absolute nonsense like that, you're not obliged to take that book seriously. At other points, you can question it. And the point that I think is widely believed, but I really am now very, very sceptical of, is that Waugh ever spent his time at White's when he should have been looking after his family's affairs. I just don't think that happened. If you look at correspondence, you have Waugh's mother writing to Alec Waugh on the 3rd of July saying Evelyn's done absolutely everything to look after us. She's very praising of his efforts. We look forward then to a letter to Alec, and you find that it's all about, I've gone through his papers, I've done this, I've done that. All of that takes time. When somebody dies, you've got coping with relatives and coping with lawyers and looking to the bank manager and finding out what the prospective income is going to be, etc., is all very, very time consuming. I just do not believe that Waugh certainly didn't know the state leave, because Lovett wrote him ordering him to the depot before 2 weeks was up. So he didn't know the state leave. That is certainly true. And the story that he just spent his days soaking in White's, I find totally improbable in the light of everything he did. So I'm right. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry, obviously got so much more to say, much more to say, but we are here today, tomorrow, so I hope we'll be able to carry this conversation on.
Can I put in a footnote?
Yeah, go on.
In the manuscript, Mr. Ryder's servant is named Hayden in half a dozen places, and it's changed to Hater later.
Yes.
Because even Waugh thought that might be a little unwise.
Okay, well, thank you so much for